was accompanied by the characteristic thumps and cracks of possessions being shed onto any convenient surface, freshly polished or not. At the sound of her voice answering from the kitchen, I had to smile. How many times had I returned here, to that ritual exchange? Dozens. Following an absence of 2 days in London, when the only things shed were furled umbrella and silk hat, or after 3 months in Europe, when 2 burly men had helped to haul inside our equipage, consisting of a trunk filled with mud-caked climbing equipment, 3 crates of costumes, many arcane and ancient volumes of worldly wisdom, and 2/3 of a motorcycle. The only time I had come to this house with less than joy was the day when Holmes and my 19-year-old self had been acting out a play of alienation, and I could see in his haggard features the toll it was taking on him. Other than that time, to enter the house was to feel the touch of comforting hands. Home. I caught up my discarded rucksack and followed Holmes through to the fire, to tea and buttered scones and welcome. Hot tea and scalding baths, conversations with Mrs. Hudson, and the accumulated post carried us to dinner. Urgent inquiries from my solicitor regarding a property sale in California. A cheerful letter from Holmes's old comrade-at-arms, Dr. Watson, currently on holiday in Egypt. A demand from Scotland Yard for pieces of evidence in regard to a case over the summer. Over the dinner table, however, the momentum of normality came to its peak over Mrs. Hudson's fiery curry, faltered with the apple tart, and then receded, leaving us washed up in our chairs before the fire, listening to the silence. I sighed to myself. Each time, I managed to forget this phase, or not forget exactly, just to hope the interim would be longer, the transition less of a jolt. Instead, the drear aftermath of a case came down with all the gentleness of a collapsing wall. One would think that following several taut, urgent weeks of considerable physical discomfort on Dartmoor, a person would sink into the undemanding downland quiet, with a bone-deep pleasure, wrapping indolence around her like a fur coat, welcoming a period of blank inertia, the gears of the mind allowed to move slowly, if at all. One would think. Instead of which, every time we had come away from a case, there had followed a period of bleak, hungry restlessness, characterized by shortness of temper, an inability to settle to a task, and the need for distraction, for which long, difficult walks or hard physical labor experience taught me were the only relief. And now, following not 1 but 2 back-to-back cases, with the client of the summer's case long dead, and that of the autumn now taken to his Dartmoor deathbed, this looked to be a dark time indeed. To this point, the worst such dark mood that I had experienced was that same joyless period just under 5 years before, when I was 19, and we had returned from 2 months of glorious, exhilarating freedom, wandering Palestine under the unwilling tutelage of a pair of infuriating Arabs, Ali and Mahmoud Khazra, only to return to an English winter, a foe after our skins, and a necessary pretense of emotional divorcement from Holmes. I am no potential suicide, but I will say that acting one at the time would not have proved difficult. Hard work, as I say, helped. Intense experiences helped too. Scalding baths, swims through an icy sea, spicy food, such as the curry Mrs. Hudson had given us. How well she knew Holmes. Bright colours. My skin still tingled from the hot water, and I had donned a robe of brilliant crimson, but the coffee in my cup was suddenly insipid. I jumped up and went into the kitchen, coming back 10 minutes later with 2 cups of steaming hot sludge that had caused Mrs. Hudson to look askance, although she had said nothing. I put 1 cup beside Holmes' brandy glass and settled down on a cushion in front of the fire with the other, wrapping both hands around it and breathing in the powerful fragrance. "What do you call this?" Holmes asked sharply. "A weak imitation of Arab coffee," I told him. "Although I think Mahmoud used cardamom, and the closest Mrs. Hudson had was cinnamon." He raised a thoughtful eyebrow at me, peered dubiously into the murky depths of the cup, and sipped tentatively. It was not the real thing, but it was strong and vivid on the palate, and for a moment the good English oak beams over our head were replaced by the ghost of a goat's hair tent, and the murmur of the flames seemed to hold the ebb and flow of a foreign tongue. New flavours, new dangers, and the son of an ancient land, the land of my people. Trials and a time of great personal discovery. Our Bedou companions, Mahmoud the Rock and Ali the Flame. Odd, I thought, how the taciturn older brother had possessed such a subtle hand at the cook-fire, and had made such an art of the coffee ritual. No, the dark substance in our cups was by no means the real thing, but both of us drank to the dregs, while images from the weeks in Palestine flickered through the edges of my mind. Dawn over the holy city, and midnight in its labyrinthine bazaar, the ancient stones of the western wall, and the great cavern quarry undermining the city's northern quarter. Ali polishing the dust from his scarlet Egyptian boots. Mahmoud's odd, slow smile of approval. Holmes' bloody back when we rescued him from his tormentor. General Allenby. And the well-suited Bentwiches. And the fair head of T.E. Lawrence, and then Holmes rattled his newspaper, and the images vanished. I fluffed my fingers through my drying hair and picked up my book. Silence reigned, but for the crackle of logs and the turn of pages. After a few minutes I chuckled involuntarily. Holmes looked up startled. "What on earth are you reading?" he demanded. "It's not the book, Holmes. It's the situation. All you need is an aged retriever lying across your slippers. We'd be a portrait of family life. The artist could call it After a Long Day. He'd sell hundreds of copies." "We've had a fair number of long days," he noted, although without complaint. "And I was just reflecting how very pleasant it was to be without demands. For a short time," he added, as aware as I that the respite would be brief between easy fatigue and the onset of bleak boredom. I smiled at him. "It is nice, Holmes. I agree." "I find myself particularly enjoying the delusory and fleeting impression that my wife spends any time at all seated at the feet of her husband. One might almost be led to think of the word subservient," he added, "seeing your position at the moment." "Don't push it, Holmes," I growled. "In a few more minutes my hair will be—" My words and the moment were chopped short by a fist crashing against the front door. The entire house seemed to shudder convulsively in reaction, and then Holmes sighed, called to Mrs. Hudson that he would answer it, and leant over to deposit his newspaper on the table. However, I was already on my feet. It is one thing to relax in the presence of one's husband and his long-time housekeeper, but quite another to have one's neighbour or farm manager walk in and find one in dishabille upon the floor. "I'll see who it is, Holmes," I said. He rose, maintaining the pipe in his hand as a clear message to our intruder that he had no intention of interrupting his evening's rest, and tightening the belt of his smoking jacket with a gesture of securing defences. But he stayed where he was, while I went to repel boarders at our door. The intruder was neither a neighbour, nor a lost and benighted Downs rambler, nor even Patrick come for assistance with an escaped cow or a chimney fire. It was a stranger dressed for town, a thick-set, clean-shaven, unevenly swarthy figure in an ill-fitting and out-of-date city suit that exuded the odour of mothballs, wearing a stiff collar such as even Holmes no longer used, and a brilliant emerald-green necktie that had been sampled by moth. The hat on his head was an equally ancient bowler, and his right hand was in the process of extending itself to me, not to shake, but open-handed, as a plea. A thin scar travelled up the side of the man's brown wrist to disappear under the frayed cuff of the shirt, a thin scar that caught at my gaze in a curious fashion. "You must help me," the stranger said. For some peculiar reason, my ears added a slight lisp to his pronunciation, which was not actually there. "I beg your pardon, sir," I began to say, and then my eyes went back to the darkness on his temple that in the shadowy doorway I had taken for hair oil. "You're hurt," I exclaimed, then turned to shout over my shoulder, "Holmes!" "You must come with me," the man demanded, his command as urgent as his fist on the wood had been. Then, to my confusion, he added a name I had not heard in nearly 5 years. "Amir," he murmured. One shoulder drifted sideways to prop itself against the door-frame. I stared at him, moving to one side so the interior light might fall more brightly on his features. I knew that face. Beardless as it was, its missing front teeth restored, the hair at its sides conventionally trimmed and framed by an incongruous suit and an impossible hat, it was nonetheless the face of a man with whom I had travelled in close proximity and uneasy intimacy for a number of weeks. I had worked with him, shed blood with him. I was, in fact, responsible for that narrow scar on his wrist. "Ali?" I said in disbelief. "Ali Hauser?" His mouth came open as if to speak, but instead he stumbled, as if the doorframe had abruptly given way. His right hand fluttered up towards his belt, but before his fingers could reach his waistcoat, his eyes rolled back in his head, his knees turned to water, and 14.5 stone of utterly limp intruder collapsed forward into my arms. Chapter 2. The man lying between the crisp white sheets of the guest bed was very like Ali Hauser, but also distinctly unlike the Arab ruffian Holmes and I had known. In fact, I had nearly convinced myself that our visitor was merely a stranger with a strong resemblance to the man, a brother perhaps, when a jab from the doctor's sewing needle brought him near to consciousness, and he growled a string of florid Arabic curses. It was Ali, all right. Before Holmes' pet medical man had clipped the thread from his half-dozen stitches, the patient had lapsed back into the restless swoon that had gripped him from the moment he fell through our door. Seeing his tossing head, and hearing the apparent gibberish from his lips, the doctor reached back into his satchel for a hypodermic needle. With that, Ali finally succumbed.